Hey, what's going on, everybody? Boilon here, and are you ready for Age of X? No? Well, don't worry, because I'm not really either. I mean, Dark Dimension 7 literally just got released the other day to almost nobody. And so now we already have details about the upcoming not month long, year long, which is going to take us well into 2025. And I find this a little bit interesting, but also not surprising. Or am I surprised? I'm not entirely sure, honestly, because I thought that they said that they were never going to do something like this again, and then there we go, that we got it. So I kind of what that tells you is basically everything is subject to change, right? We know on this channel, like, where's my button? Like this happens all the time, right? So anything that comes out is always going to be subject to change. You never know what's going to happen. So I want to talk about what kind of issues I think that this might have, despite not, this is all we know, right? But I want to kind of give some kind of context on this for those of you who might not remember. But going through the entire apocalypse year, I want to go through why a lot of us had misgivings with this, why we had some issues with this, what we didn't like about it. Now, there's a lot of people who did like this system of basically knowing what you're going to build, for the next 12 months, basically, or a year plus. But I think the biggest problem with this method is actually more so what happens at the end of that. So we're going to talk about all that and more. We're going to try to do a little bit of comparison, and then we're going to look back a little bit and kind of look at everything in perspective. So if you're ready to go, everybody, let's boil this down. Okay, so first off, this was a really big thing, right? Let's start at the bare bones at the beginning ish with the Apocalypse Saga, right? And so what was the Apocalypse Saga? Well, there was four legendary characters: Pestilence, Morgan Le Fay, Famine, Rogue, War, Red Hulk, and Death, Archangel, who came out across the year of what are we in now? Over 2022, and then Apocalypse culminated in about March 2023, I think, of last year. And so this did take roughly around a year to get all four of these characters unlocked. Now, or the teams and the characters. And in total, there was 23 characters required for the Apocalypse Saga. Okay, and so it gave some sort of structure in some way, but what a lot of people didn't like was the how prescriptive it was to have to get these characters unlocked. Right. So it wasn't just that you needed 23 characters to unlock Apocalypse to gear tier 16 for and blue ISO 4 for a baby Apocalypse, and then G17 and blue ISO 5 for big Apocalypse, but it was all of the other characters that you needed to build along the way to get them, because each of the Scourge events, which they were called, for Pestilence, Famine, War, and Death, had prescribed teams that you needed to build on top. Death actually had two sets of teams potentially to be prescribed if you count the minions as well. That was a whole separate argument. And then each of the other teams had like one main team that you were forced to build. Some people who were hyper competitive were forced to build too. And I do want to go back and take a look at basically all of the teams through the entirety of 2022, and how many of those were quote unquote required teams. Now, I think my biggest issue with the Apocalypse Saga in general, and I won't be able to see this because I've already done it, right? But basically, when you cleared all of these nodes, you would do this like in progression, like so. Some of these were Darkhold nodes, some of these were Unlimited X-Men nodes, Gamma, Death Seed, etc., and then the other characters, and then you would eventually get to the end and get Apocalypse unlocked. Now, for me, how this varies and what I don't like about this versus Dark Dimension was that at least Dark Dimension has this, I'm going to call it an illusion of choice, right? So Dark Dimension has this illusion of choice because, there's the different lanes and you can choose who you want to take into Dark Dimension. Though realistically, there is kind of like, I would say most people would agree on some sort of top 10 per lane. There's some changes depending on your uniques and what you have in your gear and whatnot. But realistically, there's a lot of like these top picks that most people take. So it really depends on when you're entering Dark Dimension as to which characters that you take. Obviously some people choose to take newer characters versus older characters, etc., etc. So there is that kind of flexibility in Dark Dimension. The other thing about Dark Dimension that was so much different than what Apocalypse was, or maybe Apocalypse was just so much different from Dark Dimension, was that you got payouts in gear. So when you completed it, you would get payouts in lots of gear. And you can see that right now if you were to go back to, or if you were just even just going to Dark Dimension 7, right? I know none of us are going to be doing that anytime soon. But if you just kind of take a look at what happens when you clear a Dark Dimension, right? You get the payouts. You get 10 pieces of gear for your first time. 5,126 random red gear pieces. That's insane. The amount of gold that this is equivalent to is just insane. I've already talked at length when it comes to like gold costs and things when it comes to red gear. And then the timed one is 50, so that's 25 equipment pieces, which is worth a lot. And then 10,000 more items of red gear across. So that's in total 15,000 red gear pieces and 25 fully crafted equipment pieces. It's bonkers, right? And so what did you get as a payout for the Apocalypse Saga? It was pretty garbage. It was like it was like blue iso crystals and blue ions, 4 and 5 ions. That was it. There was no gear refund whatsoever. And because that the Apocalypse Saga was essentially Dark Dimension, I'm going to call it Dark Dimension 5.5 or whatever, and that's because it was in between. It was 17. It was Gear Tier 17 essentially, because there was no Gear Tier 17 Dark Dimension, and this is basically what it was. And there was no gear refund because we were forced to build all of these 23 characters. Some of them, which I would have never have built otherwise. Characters like Scarlet Witch, characters like Phantom X, characters like She-Hulk. I think each team had like one or two characters that were kind of, like you don't really want to upgrade because not only were they super expensive to build, but they weren't really that great at the higher gear tier that you really needed to have them, or they got kicked off their own team. In the example of Scarlet Witch, most of the time that was the case. So that are some of the reasons why I think that the Apocalypse Saga or things like that, is going to be really, or was really, really bad. And I think that's probably my top issue with the Apocalypse Saga is that there just wasn't a refund like Dark Dimension gives. And I quite like that because I can, for sake of argument, like if I want to choose a cheaper character to go into Dark Dimension, I know that, when I do my first clear, I'm going to be able to receive some of that gear back and be able to take some better characters in. That's kind of the strategy that some people do when they approach Dark Dimension. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is the teams, right? Is that there was this whole, and I'm going to bring up my character spreadsheet. You've probably seen this before, but I want to start, but I'm going to zoom in here. I want to start around the winter patch of 2021, 2022, and I want to go through every single team and kind of what relevance they had to the Apocalypse Saga, right? And like, so what does that mean going forward with, I guess, into 2024, like this year and into 2025? What can we expect? So Magic and the Uncanny X-Men. So that nobody, you didn't really need to do that. But basically from here on, almost everything, had some requirement. So Web Warriors, right, Bio Raid team, they were the first requirements for the Darkhold team. For the Pestilence Scourge unlock, the nodes 5 and 10. Right, so you had to have them, absolutely. You couldn't do anything without them. The Ravager rework, not necessarily, though a lot of people did end up taking Ravagers for the minion section of the Death Scourge later on. Then we had Young Avengers, which turned out to be, and I doubled down on the Young Avengers too. That's the funny thing, and they they ended up being the main team for the Famine Rogue Scourge. So yes, they were a required team. Dark Hunters were a secondary team for Pestilence. Now, you didn't really need them, but people who were competing felt that they did, and so it really did feel like a required build. It was also a time when like Heroes for Hire was still a bit of a pain in the ass, and they did actually counter Heroes for Hire very well, and so there were other reasons to why people wanted to build them. Then we had the Darkhold team, which was with Morgan Le Fay, so that whole section there. Then we had Madeline Pryor. Okay, so like one character that was skippable. I didn't build Madeline Pryor. I'm really glad I didn't because it felt like a bit of a waste. There are these sort of trap teams that show up every now and then to waste your resources. But then again, we didn't know back then whether or not she or the Marauders were going to be required for Scourge events. A lot of people theorized that the Marauders were going to make a return because they seem to like to use war teams because otherwise people may have had a pass on them, right? A lot of people passed on Young Avengers initially. And then, I was really glad that I built them because then it turned out that they were a requirement for the Rogue Scourge. And then we had A-Force, who was the second team for the Rogue Famine Scourge. So then again, very few skippable things in here. Then we had Unlimited X-Men with Rogue, of course. This was over 2 patches. And then we had the Heroes Guardians with Mighty Thor, Valkyrie, and the reworks to Thor. Heimdall, and Sif. And lo and behold, that was the main team to be used for the War Scourge. So again, nothing's been skippable really at this point. Now, the second team for War was Wave 1 Avengers, and that was before we really knew anything about potential reworks for those characters. So by the time that happened later on, they did end up becoming like a better option, especially with a lot of the reworks that came sort of later after the first version of the War Scourge. And then we had Bionic Avengers. This was a raid team, so a lot of people built this team anyways. So this was actually good that they were a requirement for the Death Scourge because people would have built them for the latest raids, and so this was quite important. And then right after that, we had the Gamma team, right? And the rest, I don't know why Red Hulk was split, I guess, yeah, with Spider Weaver and the Tangled Web. Maybe I had this in the wrong order. But anyways, we had Gamma and Tangled Web with Red Hulk. Now, this is interesting because I guess because they were one of the first few Crucible teams, things like that. Spider Weaver was not. Well, actually, it did turn out actually later that Spider Weaver was required for the Apocalypse Saga, but not specifically for the Scourges. Hypothetically, you could have skipped them, but I mean, this was such a crazy team at the time that nobody did. Noir was quote unquote skippable at the time. Mr. Negative, another one of those sort of Madeline Pryors, right? Where like most people did skip Underworld, but a lot of people thought that it was going to come back to bite them later on. Turns out that it didn't. So thankfully, that Mr. Negative was a skippable character. And then we had Iron Man Zombie with Undying, which also did not turn out to be. So there are these pockets of skippable characters, and you really had to identify this or take the risk of not building them and hope that they didn't show up again later. Then we had Wakandans or War Dogs, and these were characters that you could use in the Archangel Death Scourge. Now, I personally did not. It was Wakandans or Bionic Avengers, and I chose to do Bionic Avengers. I did not level up the Wakandas myself. I skipped this entire team actually. I skipped Nakia and Black Panther 10M or whatever. I didn't level them. And then that moved into the Death Seed patch where we had Dark Beast Nemesis and Archangel with the reworks to Magneto and Psylocke. And so those were the four teams, right? And at that point, like there was maybe a handful of characters that were deemed skippable, but otherwise we needed to level everything up until this point, right? So it felt like Scopely was really breathing down our necks in terms of our roster, and there just was no variation. The biggest issue was that when you were playing PvP game modes, things like Cosmic Crucible or Alliance War, you'd come against all of the same sort of teams upgraded to the same level because people were having to do that for prescribed events, right? Like a lot of it was very samey, if that makes sense. Like you would just run into the same shit on everyone's roster because there was no variation, and that was the disappointing thing. Like it was too predictable, and I did not like that. Now, it turns out that it kind of continued in a way, but we didn't know how this was gonna kind of unfold, right? So Rebirth was the raid team. We build raid teams. Everyone, people on this channel, we build raid teams. But it did end up coming back, right? Because Rebirth was ended up using for a trial, and then we never knew when a character was gonna pop out for a legendary event like this, and so this overshadowing of like everything is required, right? It was very hard to determine or identify, what is skippable and what's not, because looming threat of like basically everything being used. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit because not everything was necessarily used in 2023, but there was still a lot of things that were kind of required. I did skip nowhere, of course, like a lot of people know. And so this kind of brings us into patch wherever we are, pat 2024 and into 2025. I think what we have learned so far when it comes to the Age of X is that basically, that this is going to take some time. We're going to be moving into, eventually we're going to move into new sets of patches and new sets of characters and new sets of teams. And what hasn't been confirmed yet, I suppose, is whether or not we're still keeping the Scourge system. At least I don't think that's been confirmed. Let me know in the comments down below if I missed something. But what I am very curious to know is, are we going to be using one team for the legendary? Because we know of Out of Time, right? So Out of Time is going to be the team required to unlock the next legendary, which people are already assuming is going to be this cowboy western character in the background. Maybe it's a variant character, who knows? And that's the next legendary character. But the question is, are we only going to need out of time? They did backtrack on Cabal, but are they going to bring back and say, hey, you can use this secondary team? Or are they just going to have out of time? We're going to use it for 2 nodes in a Scourge-like system, and that's it, right? Like, so they said that they want to do better and improve upon the Apocalypse experience. And my question would be, to do that for me, like what would be acceptable for me, Boilon? And I think that would be a lot of the things that I explained earlier on when it came to the Apocalypse Saga, right? It was make it more Dark Dimension-esque, and I think I would be happy, right? Like make it so that when I unlock Professor Xavier, that I get I get a refund of some kind, right? So if I'm forced to have to build these characters that I don't necessarily like the Scarlet Witches of whatever team, then at least I get some payouts later back that will like kind of refund what I put into her a little bit, or those characters or whoever they end up being, and I would be okay with that. Um, Whatever the requirement ends up being, that's another question. And actually, I'm gonna probably lead into the end of the video here talking about that. So, is it going to be a G19 requirement in tandem with Dark Dimension 7 and Mephisto, or are we expecting it to be a Gear Tier 20 and essentially skipping what would have been Dark Dimension 8? They haven't really come out and said that, and so I'm gonna throw that back to you all, and let me know in the comments down below what you think. Do you think it's going to be a G19, or sorry, yeah, G19 with some other requirement? Or do you think it's going to be a G20 that we're basically expected to do after Mephisto? It feels with the timeline, because we're talking about 2025. You guys have seen the videos that I made on Dark Dimension 7, right? We're looking at probably free to play about 9 months out. That's the average expectation that I would have. And from now, that would basically put us pretty close into 2025. And so if they're thinking about doing Xavier for the early, maybe first quarter of 2025, that lines things up a bit awkward on the G19 spectrum. So part of me thinks that they might make you choose, and that part doesn't sit that well with me, because they're going to be completely different characters that you're going to be using, both for the Dark Dimension 7 chase and the Xavier chase. But I think that's all I have to say for just now. Otherwise, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I don't mind it on the surface. They just need to clean up some of the issues that I had with Apocalypse, namely this stuff. And if they can add this in there, then it'll make it a lot more palatable for the rest of the player base, I think. But if I miss something, feel free to leave that down below as well. So that's going to be the end of this video, everyone. And until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'll see you all later. Boilon signing out.